From CITI program, I'm Darren Gaddis, and this is On Campus. Today, what is instructional design? How do online courses differ from face-to-face courses? And how to create an online community? I spoke with Diana Brandon, a teaching faculty member of the Educational Psychology and Learning Systems program at Florida State University on instructional design. As a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to provide legal advice or guidance. You should consult with your organization's attorneys if you have questions or concerns about relevant laws and regulations discussed in this podcast. Additionally, the views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the presenter. Hi, Diana. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
To get us started, what is instructional design?
To put it very, very simply, instructional design is building things to help people learn. And that can look a little bit different depending on how you're doing the building or how complex you want to make it. But that's the simple definition for what instructional design would be.
And to dive a little bit deeper into that, how does instructional design in an online course setting differ from a traditional face-to-face course setting?
There's a lot more front work, I would argue, for an online course because you're working in the context of every student's location. So in a face-to-face course, the context of what you're doing is all the same. All the students are in the same room. They have access to the same or generally the same materials. Because of that, they have the same distractions as far as the environment that they're in. But when you start working in an online environment, that environment is different for every single student that you have. Some are working in really quiet spaces, some have toddlers, some have animals, some are traveling, some are in different time zones. So that context looks very, very different. And that in turn means that the design of the instruction needs to accommodate those differences as much as it can.
Thinking about the differences in an online course, what can administrators, faculty, and staff do to create more of an online community for students and to engage students more?
So you could answer that in so many different ways. I think one of the first things that we see is access. So are we making sure that the materials we're loading in are accessible for learners who need different access accommodations, whether that's a visual impairment or an auditory impairment, and making materials accessible in that way is something that absolutely has to be done. The course structure, if you're talking about a traditional course or kind of more of a massive online open course, making the course structure something that learners can follow. Is it well organized? Is it visually appealing? Are things logically the way they should be? You can never check your links enough. That's something that I do every week in every single one of my courses, and I have yet to have a semester go by when at least one link is not broken by the time the students get to it, despite the fact that I check it. And I think that one of the things that is probably the biggest struggle in online learning is that sense of community. When you're in a face-to-face course, everybody shows up a couple minutes early and you can sit and have your coffee and you talk about things that have nothing to do with the course. It might be the weather. It might be someone's new shoes. It might be anything. It could be a contextual, they're talking about artwork in the classroom. It could be literally anything. And you build that sense of community in a very unique way. So building that in an online course is a real challenge, but that's a really important piece. And we do that with discussions where people can actually interact with one another. We do it with Zoom meetings. We do it with informal integrations. I play 2 truths and a lie in all of my courses because it's a way to get people to know each other. I survey my students. I work in small groups so that they have an opportunity to interact, and I encourage my students to interact outside of that, that singular assignment. So talking in Slack, exchanging phone numbers, a lot of things that would still happen in a traditional course, but need to be a little bit more guided in an online course to build that sense of community is really important. From an instructional design perspective, you can also consider the materials that you're putting in and making sure that they are accessible around the world. In an online classroom, your students can literally be global. And so adjusting for time zones and making those settings work for the student is really important. Selecting materials that are accessible through ebooks so that people don't have to rely on postal mail to get things, because that's not always the best delivery system, especially with some of the supply chain issues that we've seen very recently. Making things available directly within the course or via email is really something else that can be done to help students. And I think remembering that students are people, and a lot of times we see online learners look very different than the traditional learners that we see on campus. When we are talking about higher education, we have learners who are perhaps not necessarily new to learning, but they may have been out of the classroom for quite a while and things have changed, particularly with reference to technology. So being really patient with helping students to get oriented and grounding them in this is what the class looks like now compared to the last time they were in the classroom. I think it's also really important that you remember that a lot of times on campus, students are full-time students, whether they're undergrad or graduate. We see a lot more full-time students on campus compared to online, where online students might be taking a course or two, but they also have, another job that's full-time. They might have family responsibilities, taking care of parents or children or pets. They may have community involvement responsibilities. And so school may be the fourth or fifth or sixth priority on their plate. And so really being flexible with what expectations are while at the same time maintaining high quality so that students are getting that high quality education that they're really looking for, just in a manner that's flexible enough that they can work with all of the other pieces of their lives.
And focusing more on the student-centric aspect of that, for students, how are they able to assist in co-creating an online community?
I think that looks different for every learner, and I think that looks different for every instructor in the course. A lot of what you get out of an online community is what you put into it. Of course, you have people who are the lurkers who just kind of sit back and watch, the same way that you would in a face-to-face party have people who kind of sit in the corner and people watch. You also have that in an online community. It's very easy for people to kind of get left behind that way. So being really intentional about engaging with learners throughout the class and engaging with all of the learners as much as possible, providing that small group opportunities where everybody gives feedback to everybody else, or providing those one-on-one opportunities where you can really get to know the student and then suggest partnerships based on interest or career goals or career experiences is something that instructors do as well. But you get out of an online community what you put into it. So making an effort to engage, making an effort to relate to your peers is going to get learners a lot farther than expecting those peers to come to them.
Diana, what else do we need to know?
Online learning in particular has a reputation for being lesser. It's not as good as traditional learning, or it's not as robust, or it's not as challenging. And I don't think that's accurate, because I think that we have all been in really bad face-to-face classes. But just because that one class was bad, it doesn't mean that face-to-face instruction is bad. Similarly, we have all been in really bad online learning settings. That doesn't mean that all online learning is bad or not challenging or easy to cheat. It means that there are a mix no matter what the modality is. And I think that online learning was probably one of the biggest changes that we saw during COVID. And we saw a lot of it that was done really poorly because that wasn't online learning. That was emergency remote teaching. That was kind of an oh crap moment where we had to really scramble globally to try and do as much as we could to replace face-to-face education with something that was accessible online when everybody was in lockdown. And a lot of people, that was their first experience with online learning, especially in the K-12 world. And that's not an accurate representation or a fair representation of what online learning can be. So I think that that is something to keep in mind. Both that online learning can be challenging, it can be robust, and it can be valuable. It's going to look different than challenging, robust, and valuable face-to-face instruction because it is different. It is online. But that doesn't mean that it's any less valuable. It just means it's different. And I think that the second point that we really need to remember is that the emergency shift that we saw during COVID was not online teaching. That was, I believe the term being used is emergency remote teaching. But that was scrambling, and that's not what we want online learning to be. We want it to be well planned and well organized and well executed. And anytime you're scrambling, you're not going to get well planned, well executed, and well organized.
Diana, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe to On Campus with CITI program to stay in the know. I also invite you to review our content offerings regularly as we are continually adding new courses and webinars that may be of interest to you. All of our content is available to you anytime through organizational and individual subscriptions. You may also be interested in CITI programs Managing Conflict with Your Dissertation Chair webinar. Please visit the CITI program's website to learn more about all of our offerings.